בשלנו, ושיחה מאוד מעניינת עם לא אחר מאשר איש השבוע, אולי איש השנה אפילו, ג'פרי גולדברג, שהוא העורך הראשי של אטלנטיק, מגזין אמריקאי משפיע ביותר, והוא בשיחה איתנו בעצם הוא מדבר על טיב היחסים בין ישראל לארצות הברית, וג'פרי גולדברג, רק נזכיר ככה את ההקשר, היו לו חשיפות מאוד מעניינות על התבטאויות של טראמפ בנוגע
חשיפות שיכולות להשפיע על עתיד הבחירות בארצות הברית. אני מציע מאוד להקשיב היטב לנאום של ג'פרי גולדברג, יש לו מסרים מאוד מעניינים על יחסי יהדות ארצות הברית לישראל, על הקשרים בין ארצות הברית לישראל. אני חושב ששווה מאוד להקשיב לרעיון הזה בקשב רב.
בהחלט, אחד העיתונאים המשפיעים, אולי העיתונאי המשפיע בארצות הברית, ג'פרי גולדברג, The Atlantic. בואו נראה את הרעיון.
First of all, I would like to thank you for taking part in our strategic event. For me personally, it's very important, but it's important also for the event. You are chief editor of Atlantic, but I remember you since long time as brilliant, reliable, qualitative journalist. I would like to ask you, how do you see the world after 20th of January? What will happen? What is the forecast? And based also on your unbelievable scoop, as the one who served in the army, I couldn't read it. I tried to read it. I've ended reading it, but with difficulties. So how do you see the world? What will change for the worst, for the best? I don't know.
Well, the short answer is I don't know. The short answer is also you don't know. No one knows. From an American perspective right now, I think the real question is, you know, there's maybe for the first time ever, at least at this level, we had this problem in the year 2000 with Gore and Bush, problem in 1876 around these same issues, but we don't know what's going to happen on election day, or more to the point, after election day. We don't know. These two politicians will not, Donald Trump will not concede. I think that's fairly, even if he loses, I don't think there's going to be an easy concession. And I think that Americans are sitting here thinking that we might be in a situation where come January 20th, when you're supposed to swear in a new president, or for the second term of a presidency, we might have two men fighting out who is a legitimate president. It sounds like, you know, some ancient papal state, controversy. So there's that. And so I think we're all obsessed right now, as we should be, with the smooth transition of power in our democracy. Democracy brings up another point, which is, I think if the two of us were talking 5 years ago, we would have both said, well, you know, democracy comes and fits and starts, but it comes. That's the natural progression of organized human life toward democracy. I don't think anyone can say that anymore. We seem to be in a reaction phase. The dictatorships and authoritarian regimes abetted by technology and abetted by a kind of weariness around the subjects of representation and human rights and so on, and by coronavirus and all the rest. I think there's an open question about whether the world is moving away from democratic ideals toward a kind of technologically embedded authoritarianism. So, you know, and we're also learning of something about the limitations of our ability to change outcomes. It's surprising to me, not just the United States' response to coronavirus or Israel's response to coronavirus, but just the globe's ability to sort of function together. This is the absence of American leadership, obviously, is part of the issue. One of the things we know from the last 80 or so years, 70 or 80 years, is that whatever you think of the United States, it does have convening power, organization power, diplomatic and military power, and it uses that power often to try to bring clarity to issues, sets of issues that are important for the whole globe. You know, we have left the stage now. I don't know if we've left for good, but we've left now. And so I have a lot of trepidation about what happens in 2021.
Let's assume that Biden will get the presidency. What will be different from the presidency now? Or if Trump gets reelected, what will happen to the world? Because the United States is the leader of the world. And lack of leadership means vacuum. And we can see isolation, we can see Security Council, we can see the leadership over Europe. I mean, many issues. How, based on your long experience, what is your forecast?
Well, let me just agree with you on one thing, one word you used, the vacuum. I think that geostrategy, I think that the international order, like nature, I think it abhors a vacuum. It can't exist in a vacuum. So if you remove this is from a Washington-centric view of the world, okay? From the U.S. perspective, there are three regions that matter the most from an economic, political, security perspective. Asia, East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. If there's a vacuum created by the permanent withdrawal of the United States from those regions, it's not chaos. It's China in Asia, it's Russia in Europe, it's Iran in the Middle East. I mean, if you remove a good power, and I believe that the United States is a good power. I mean, we make all kinds of mistakes, but we're basically trying to be a good power. If you remove the United States and replace it with China, Russia, and Iran, well, you know, I don't have to tell you what that means for the way the world is organized and the way the world is run. And that's why I come back to this point about democracy. So I don't think it will be a vacuum. I think that the leaders of Russia and China they can't believe their luck in some kind of way. I mean, the Chinese have more of a problem with Trump. I mean, they enjoy many aspects of Trump, but obviously Trump is running against China right now, as well as Biden. He's not running against Russia, certainly. I mean, he's a Russian dream come true. So there's that, and the Iranians have, you know, a fear that he'll do something wild or erratic. But you know, if Trump wins, I think we're looking at the end of we might be in the end already, but we're looking at the end of a very, very stable post-World War II international order that was essentially organized and chaired, if you will. Imagine it at a global meeting. It was sort of chaired by the United States. That comes to an end. I think Biden, if he won, would try to restore, first of all, I mean, he would spend a lot of time at the very beginning of his presidency going around the world, going to our allies, saying, I'm sorry for what happened. It was a midlife crisis. You know, we had a president, he went out and bought a sports car and left his wife. You know what I mean? I'm trying to use the analogy of a midlife crisis. And he would have to go tell our allies that we're with you. We respect our treaties, spend a lot of time with NATO, obviously. We spend a lot of time elsewhere in Asia. And people would not necessarily believe it at first because, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And I think world leaders and analysts like yourself would ask the question, okay, fine, you seem to be back to normal, but your country, its politics are very bipolar. You swing radically. And, you know, so it would be a hard mission, but I think Biden would try to restore to some degree America's standing in the world and become that international convener. In other words, if you had Biden as president right now, he would be making an honest effort to try to lead the world's response to coronavirus. That's not what we have now. That's just one example.
In the Middle East, we are facing changes, like the blessed new peace agreement treaty with UAE.
I don't think it's a peace agreement, right? Can I ask you a question? Do you call it a peace agreement? I mean, Israel and UAE weren't at war.
Normalization, never mind. It's important by itself. On the other hand, we do see vis-a-vis U.S. leadership the problems with Turkey, the challenge of Iran. Iran is not going to disappear. Turkey is getting more and more aggressive. I do think personally the Saudis will not join this normalization agreement as long as the Palestinian issue is not solved, and it's far away from being solved. Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan angry. How do you see the Middle East now, in the coming months, and under each of these presidents?
Through the prism of American relations, or just generally speaking?
America, Middle East, and Israel, from the American perspective.
I understand Iran's role in the Middle East, its malign influence in the Middle East, the danger it poses to Israel and to moderate Sunni states and to American security interests. I don't necessarily think that the American response to Iran right now is the most effective. I mean, it feels like America is more isolated than Iran in some days of the week. But let me put that aside. I mean, we could break this down in a million different pieces, but in terms of Israel and U.S., I think the differences now are very, very stark between the two parties. More, more dramatically different than they've ever been before. The Trump administration, along with the Prime Minister of Israel, I think believe that you can bypass the Palestinians entirely. That you make these bilateral relationships, small Gulf states and maybe some other countries, and that counts as peace. No one is against those. I mean, obviously the Iranians are against those, but no one in the United States is against that kind of diplomacy. It's a good thing, especially when you think about the possibilities of keeping Iran boxed in, contained, however you want to frame it, right? But it's not peace. And you can't ignore the Palestinian issue forever. Israel has to decide what it's going to be. The danger from an American political perspective for Israel is that Israel has become or is becoming a partisan issue. I mean, we've talked about this in the past. For decades, Israeli prime ministers working with AIPAC and other groups have tried to make sure that Israel had bipartisan support in Congress. The Democratic Party, now is, I think it's, unless there's some significant change in the way that Israel approaches the Palestinian issue, I think the Democratic Party is becoming more and more alienated from Israel. I think younger American Jews especially are becoming more and more alienated from Israel. And so, again, this goes to that larger theme of everything changing. Some of the truths that we've held to be self-evident for 20, 30, 40 years might no longer be true in the coming days. I don't want to keep going on this subject because I can go on forever, but I think a Trump re-election would solidify the idea that Israel is a Republican cause, and that therefore, if Trump is for Israel, a lot of Democrats are going to be against it.
You have just published unbelievable scoop about President Trump. It's so important. Can you share with us something about behind the scenes? How can we understand such behavior? I mean, I'm shocked personally. Can you share with us?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that hard. If you think about Donald Trump, he only understands human relations through transaction. When he goes to NATO and he said, he doesn't understand why NATO is important for, let's say, ideological or idealistic reasons. He just feels like America's NATO allies are robbing the United States. Everything is a transaction. He's a very material-oriented person. That extends, and this is it's a malevolent extension of this principle, but he also doesn't understand anyone who would do anything for other than money. I mean, I'm putting it as simple as I can. It's an attitude that says selflessness. He doesn't understand selflessness. He doesn't understand service. He reads words that praise service, but he actually thinks, and this goes back to Vietnam, the way he got out of the Vietnam draft, claiming a medical exemption. He's on record as saying that people who went to Vietnam were suckers, quote unquote. I believe that the word you use is friar, but basically his world is divided into friars and non-friars, It's not that hard to understand if you understand that he does not believe that people do things or should do things for idealistic reasons. So someone who commits their life, here's a good example from the story I wrote. General Joe Dunford, who was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marine general, great military leader, I'm sure you know him, was giving a presentation in the White House one day, finished, left the room, and Donald Trump turned to some aides and said, "That guy is really smart. Why did he join the military?" In other words, why would somebody with a brain choose not to make money? So it's all rooted in this. And I'm also not a psychiatrist. I'm not going to try to speculate about what else motivates this. But I explain it to myself through the prism of transactionalism. Look, and I understand that in Israel especially, this is not a conversation that would happen very often, where there's more societal cohesion, more societal purpose, and there's an understanding that national service is the glue that holds the country together. But that's not his attitude.
What is your opinion about the normalization agreement between UAE and Israel? Do you have any information about the qualitative military edge? And if you add something to your fantastic interview, classic one, with President Obama, which lessons we need to draw from that?
I don't have any information to add, nothing that you don't know, certainly. So it's never a bad thing, right, to have these relations, I suppose. I do feel like it allows the Israeli government, the current Israeli government, to avoid a subject, which is what to do about the Palestinians. That's why I asked before, do you call it a peace treaty? To me, it doesn't strike me as a peace treaty because the UAE and Israel aren't at war. It's normalization of diplomatic relations, which is a good thing, but it's not peace in the Middle East. Peace in the Middle East will come if the Palestinians and Israelis can figure out a way to live together in two states next to each other. That's my phone. And so I don't believe that I don't believe that it's a peace treaty, and I also worry that it's an avoidance mechanism. On the other hand, and I'm actually, if this was reversed, I would be asking you a lot of questions on this subject. On the other hand, what I'm interested in trying to understand is, does this sort of thing convince any Palestinians that Israel is just a permanent presence in the Middle East, that the Jewish national presence in the Middle East is permanent? I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about for years after watching Palestinian national leadership reject several offers to create a state. Does this, and spending a lot of time in particular in Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon, where people are living in a fantasy, in a dream palace, where they think Israel is sort of a tent in a windstorm, and it's just going to blow away. I'm wondering if this actually convinces Palestinians to deal with Israel as it is, rather than what they wish it would be, which would be, a temporary, very flimsy presence in the Middle East. So maybe that has a kind of teaching for Palestinians. But look, the conflict has been going on for 100 years. I don't think that Palestinian national polity is going to look and see what UAE did and say, oh, well, I guess our struggle is over because UAE recognized Israel, so we might as well go back to the negotiating table and take what we can get. I don't see that. I mean, you might have a very different opinion, but I don't see that. In terms of Obama, you know, I just go back very quickly to what I said about the Democrats. You know, one of my worries during the Obama years was that I believe Obama to be fundamentally pro-Israel, anti-occupation, but pro-Israel. He's no different than Shimon Peres, no different than a lot of politicians on the center left in Israel. And I think that the way the conservative government in Israel talked about him was mainly for domestic purposes. I don't think it was accurate. But again, it was two parties talking past each other. A mainstream Democrat like Barack Obama talking about Israel lovingly but critically, and an Israel that, for whatever reason, didn't understand what was going on. And so this is what I always say about Obama and Israel, that right now at Columbia University, let's say, where Obama went, there's a 20-year-old version of Barack Obama who one day might be president, who doesn't have the same sympathy for the Zionist project that Barack Obama had. He might have the same background, the same inclinations, but Obama had, and I think you know this, innate sympathy for the idea. He articulated this in a million different ways, but was very critical of Netanyahu, very critical of occupation, very critical of settlement, and wanted people to focus on that. And what's coming in the Democrats is not necessarily Obama. It's someone who just looks at Israel as a kind of reactionary state in the Middle East. And that, I think, long-term for Israel is a problem. But, you know, your politicians, generally speaking, don't have a great track record of thinking in long-term, in the long term.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you. It is fantastic interview, and I'm at your disposal.
Thank you very much. I appreciate doing it.